Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another Business Vision webinar. Hope you're all well this afternoon. For those who don't know me and the webinars, I'm Mark Lawson, Managing Director of Business Vision, and that's a Plymouth firm of accountants, but we specialise in helping small and medium businesses grow their business, grow their sales, grow their profits, increase cash flow, and hopefully spend less time in the business achieving it. And these webinars are part of the sort of training that we do with clients day in, day out. So welcome. Over the next 30 to 45 minutes, we're going to be looking at how to achieve record results and avoid costly mistakes. Now, if we can just have a quick show of hands, if you can put your hand up, if you make mistakes in your business place or workplace. Now, it is a webinar, so obviously I can't see hands going up, but I'm guessing that everybody will have their hands up unless possibly you're in a internet cafe, in which case might be a bit too embarrassed to do that. But it's something that happens day in, day out in businesses, and we all know that it happens and it's frustrating, and we're going to look at some of the problems that causes a bit further down the road. But in essence, they are eminently stoppable. We're going to look how to do that during the course of this session to see how we would stop those happening. And it's more frustrating when you get the same mistakes happening time and time again. There's an old saying that to make a mistake once is perfectly natural. To make a mistake twice is foolish, but to make it more than twice is just plain stupid. So we'll be looking at that as we go through. But if you have said that you see mistakes in workplace, just rest assured that it's happening to everybody else. And before we sort of start properly, here's a few semi-funny, although not funny if it's your business, examples of how mistakes can manifest themselves in business. So that's one there, which again seems stupid, but you can see how that might happen. Another one there, and that one which isn't quite so obvious when you first look at it. But all of these things happen day in, day out, and to the outsider they shouldn't happen. And the outsider for most of us is obviously going to be the customer. Can sometimes affect team members. We'll have a look at that in a moment, but typically these are things that affect the business and primarily customers, and we've all experienced that when we deal with other businesses as a customer, that mistakes happen and we don't understand how it can happen and why they can't avoid it, and particularly if it's happened to us several times, we would find that very frustrating. So what can happen in terms of mistakes in businesses? Well, they are costly. You know, no matter small errors even can be costly. Primarily time wasting. So most errors will waste time at the very least. We've seen examples in businesses. So for example, and I'm not picking on businesses, this can happen to anybody, plumbers, electricians might send out the tradesperson to do a job that's been booked in. They get there and realise that they don't have the right materials, the right tools to do that job. So they've got to shoot back to stores, pick up the right stuff, go back to the customer and recommence. Well, that clearly is going to frustrate the customer because that job is now going to take far longer than was expected. And that's assuming that the plumber or electrician turned up on time in the first place. But also it means that the customer they've got to go to next is now being pushed back. So they're going to be late through no fault of their own. And there will be examples of time wasting in any business. And that's money. Time is money. Associated with that will be rework. So where there's remedial work to be done, that's also going to not only waste time, but money as well. And particularly will cause problems with customers because they'll notice that there are errors, there's things that need to be redone. So again, you know, if we take the plumber and electrician example, if the plumber was out there fixing a dripping tap, says it's all done, and then 3 hours later the problem comes back, then that plumber's got to go back out. He probably won't be able to charge for going back out because it's something that should have been sorted in the first place. So customer not happy, the business not happy because they've had to spend time effectively spending twice as many hours doing one job. So their hourly rate is now halved. And ultimately from those errors, depending on the patience and willingness of the customer, you will lose customers as a result of those. And we all know that if you lose customers, the knock-on effect is that they're about 8 times more likely to discuss problems with people they know than things that went exceptionally well, because that's the norm, that's what they expect to happen. So that's going to get, bad press. And in the current era where most of these things can find their way onto the internet, that's not going to be great in terms of gaining new customers either. And lastly, and not necessarily leastly, is it's hugely frustrating to the team, because it affects them being able to do their job. Nobody wants to be doing the same work twice. Nobody wants to have to basically waste a load of time doing the job. They want things to move forward, because time's precious for them as well. So those are just some examples of the problems that we would come across when errors are made in the business. So let's just look at what we're going to talk about as a solution today, and just bear with me for a minute, because I think your initial reaction might be just to switch off. The simple solution is checklist. Now, I know you're going to be going, I don't need to attend a half-an-hour seminar to know how to do a checklist, thank you very much. But the reality is we deal with hundreds and hundreds of businesses, and none of them are doing checklists either properly or at all in many cases. So although they're aware of checklists, they're not being used in businesses to their full extent, if at all. And the result of that is all of these businesses are making mistakes far more than they need to. I'm not suggesting that checklists will eliminate errors, but it will certainly make a drastic difference to how that will work. So we're going to go through some stories to illustrate how checklists have helped businesses and industries. And we're also going to go through a 5-point plan to help you get it right in your business or workplace. So as I say, I know this is a very simple solution, but the reality is if you put your hand up earlier to say that mistakes are happening, then I can guarantee that they aren't being used to their full potential. And the fact that they're simple is great, because it means that you haven't got a huge amount to work, which can often be the case with some of these webinars in terms of getting more sales, etc. So before we go into the stories, in order to highlight checklists, I can guarantee that you would not want to fly with an airline if you didn't feel that the captain hadn't gone through a very rigorous checklist about all the things that need to be in place before they take off. If we knew that they were just ignoring checklists, then I suspect we wouldn't go a million miles near it. And it's not just the big stuff that need to be checked with checklists. For example, on planes, it's the little stuff like, are the hinges on the drop-down trays on each seat rusty? Because it's known that some customers will look at that and worry that if the hinges there are rusty, what else isn't being looked after on the plane? So as I say, we expect those things to happen when air pilots take off. Why wouldn't we expect that to happen in the business? And it's just having the right method and the right methodology to use that properly in the same way that pilots do. So a couple of stories before I go through the methodology. The first one, which we're largely using to put some of the basis of this seminar for you in place, is a book called the Checklist Manifesto. And that's written by a guy called Atul Gawande. And he was a consultant at an intensive care unit in I don't know whether this is in the UK or America, but it's the equivalent of National Health. And he basically realized that there were some problems with how they do things in hospitals, and he tested a checklist for one task only just to see how it worked. And that task was a doctor inserting a central line into a vein with a long needle. So a fairly straightforward thing, things that happen regularly in an intensive care unit. And the checklist was very, very simple. He basically had a checklist of 5 things that needed to happen before that procedure could take place. And the first one was for the doctor to wash hands with soap. The second one was to clean skin with antiseptic. The third one was to put sterile drapes over the patient. The fourth one was to wear sterile clothing and a mask and hat. And the fifth one was to fit sterile dressing to the site of insertion on the patient. Now, all of those things we would probably assume are fairly straightforward, and if we were the patient, we would probably hope that they were happening in every single case. But the reality was they weren't. And when they tested the checklist to start with, even though the doctors knew that those things had to happen, there was nothing really to remind them to do it. And what happened is when they started to bring in the checklist, the nurses found that about 1 in 3 cases still weren't being complied with on 1 out or more of those 5 items. And that was down to the doctors. So what they then did, as well as introduce the checklist, is they allowed the nurses to stop the doctors if they didn't go through the 5 points. So the nurses had the checklist and they talked the doctor through it, and if they didn't do that, then nothing moved forward. And the result of that very simple checklist that we perhaps assume would be happening anyway was that the infection rate in that intensive care unit went down from 11% to none. So that's more than 1 in 10 people having an infection after the procedure, which sounds ridiculous. But as I say, those sort of ridiculous things will be happening in our businesses as well if we decided to look at it. It's just we don't tend to notice it like a patient or customer would do. And then 15 months later, they ascertained that that simple procedure had prevented 43 infections, prevented 8 deaths, and saved £1.8 million in effectively redoing the operation and sorting out, curing the infection problems and all the things that were associated with customers, patients dying. So, in terms of customer satisfaction, patient satisfaction, great, but also in terms of saving time and money as well. And presumably, team morale was a lot higher because they knew that they were doing their job properly every time, first time, which is what we all ultimately probably want. So that's a great example of how the checklist can work. And I would recommend that if this sounds of use to your business, that you visit that book. It's a relatively quick and easy read, but it goes through all the stages of how they went through that procedure and how it can be applied. Second story is based in Karachi, and what they were finding there is that they had a huge problem with children mortality. 1 in 10 children were dying before they reached the age of 5. So that's 10% of children dying, in their childhood, very early age, and that clearly is a problem. We don't have that in our country, but certainly over there they recognise that as a huge problem. So they initially decided that they would try antibacterial soap instead of normal soap. And what they found with that, even though the antibacterial soap was obviously better, it made absolutely no difference to that mortality rate. And they did further research and realised that actually it wasn't the nature of the soap that was the problem. It was people using it and how they were using it and the method. So training was effectively the issue, to let people know what to do and how to do it to avoid it. So they introduced a checklist, and it was even simpler than the one I've just mentioned, in that there was only 3 items on the checklist which was used as a training tool. First one was to wet both hands completely. The second one was to lather well, and the third one was to then rinse all the soap off. Just those 3 items in the checklist. And what then happened in Karachi as a result of that was cases of diarrhea, which was the main cause of mortality in those children, was down by 52%, and pneumonia was also down by 48%. So a huge increase in health benefits just by a simple 3-point checklist. But it's important to realise that that was actually a detailed checklist written down, rather than just somebody having it in their head, where, like doctors, they could just ignore it when they felt like it or forget it, as we often will do. So a couple of cases there to illustrate the power of checklists and why they can be so important in your business, despite how simple they are to implement, and as an idea, possibly one that you might have ignored so far. So hopefully those stories will give you a flavour and certainly get you feeling that it's worth doing in your business. So I said we'd look at a 5-step process to ensure that these checklists will work in your business or in your workplace. It's quite likely that you could implement some checklists and they'd certainly have an impact, but there is a 5-step process that can be looked at that will make sure it works as perfectly as it possibly can. So I'm going to run through those 5 steps now to get it working where you are. Step 1 is to define mission critical tasks in the business, ones that are already failing, which we would generally know about. We know which areas work well, we know which areas don't work well, and the ones that don't work well tend to be the ones that we ought to look at, but also the ones where it's slightly more difficult to actually get it right, otherwise we'd have done that already. And the reason we're going for mission critical tasks is clearly those are the most important. We're not suggesting that you attack every single area that's causing problems in your business or workplace straight away. You go for the ones that are going to have the best impact, the same as they did with the intensive care unit. Is obviously infection rate was a big problem, and in Karachi infant death was a problem as well. So mission critical tasks to start with, and those you'll probably know what they are, but they're generally the ones that keep the business owner awake at night. They're the ones that generally tend to be, but not always, customer focused, because that's clearly where we want to get the errors sorted to start with. And they're the ones where we may have regular complaints. So that could be, timekeeping, it could be the accuracy or the way that things are done. And get your team to tell you what they think those mission critical tasks are as well. So the things that help your business do what it needs to do every time, accurately and properly. And some of those won't be working, many of them won't be working. So pick the ones that you think are most mission critical to the business and just start with those. And I'd probably pick 5 or 6 to start with, get those working, see what the impact is, and then you can move on to ones a bit further down the ladder. So that's step 1. Step 2 is to establish the current measure of these failures. It's quite important that these are all accompanied by measurements, and the 2 stories I gave you clearly had measurements of the before and after. So we need to know how we would measure that, because we need to know that the checklist was working. If we do checklist and we make everybody follow it, we need to be sure that that's achieving some benefit rather than just people's view. Because if you ask somebody whether it worked and there was no measurement, they might well go, nothing's changed, I knew all this already, where clearly that won't be the case. So establish the current measure. Now, for our business, that may well be, for example, may have a problem with accounts going out late. So the measurement would be how many days does it take between those accounts records coming in and them going out to the client. It could also measure, because days would be an average, we might also want to measure the longest delay, because having 90% on time but having the late ones being really late is quite important to know. And we could also measure the number that's over the target as well. So, of all the ones that go out, what percentage actually go out in the determined target time. Could be, for us as accountants, errors in accounts, and we could measure that by the percentage of version 2s of the accounts we have to do to correct those changes. Because again, clients would be aware of that. Usually they're often the ones that would be highlighting those errors, and from an accountant's point of view, it's going to take time and wages bills to correct it and send it back out. So that would be a measurement there. And for us, because we don't just concentrate on accounts and tax returns, like many accountants, we do an awful lot of business growth. So we might want to just measure the number of business growth ideas missed. We could measure that as a number or a pound value, because that would be very important to us as well. And I would think there's probably 100 measurements we could come up with in our business, but initially we're only going to measure the key ones. So know what they are before you implement the checklist, so that you can see what the failure rate is, see what the failure measurement is, and then you would revisit those measurements once the checklist is in place and periodically make sure that that's improving, and then go through those improvements with the team. Third step is to basically assess and discuss what steps are needed to have prevented the failures that have happened in the past. And this is the important bit, because this is where we go, how can that problem be solved? Now, clearly, you're not going to get all the ideas to stop every single error immediately, but you're going to get them down drastically if you can work out what needs to happen. So this is effectively designing what goes in the checklist. And your team are going to know that, and ideally the team that would have the best ideas are the ones that are involved in doing that work. So if it's the plumber going out, it shouldn't be the managing director coming up with the ideas, because they may not really understand exactly what goes on. It's the plumber going out, realizing that they don't have all the tools, and then going back. They're the ones that should say what the problem is, and they'll have ideas on how to solve that as well. So every step of that particular problem has to be assessed and discuss, what do we need to stop it? And hopefully you'll come up with a load of ideas, and that then needs to be worked out into a checklist. Once you've got those, you then need to create the first draft of the checklist, and there will be several drafts, because they won't work perfectly immediately. Now, a good checklist, in order for it to work as well as it can do, needs to be precise. So a long 60-point checklist isn't going to do it, because people will just give up and it won't happen. They need to be efficient and to the point. They need to be practical, so they need to be able to be understood and used by the people who are actually going to do the job that it relates to. And that's why the people who do the job should be involved in creating the first draft and the ideas that go in it as well. And it should be relevant, so it should only include the most critical, important tasks, not trying to cover every single possible thing that might go wrong, just the main things, because you can always tweak it later once the main things are sorted, and you then move on to the lesser things. So precise, efficient, practical and relevant is what you need. And then basically implement it. So put that into implementation and agree a date when you're going to review the measurements of the before and after. And at that stage, you can then start to A, prove that it's worked, but B, you can start to then tweak it and go, what happened to cause errors despite the checklist being there, and how do we now go through the second stage of working out how to stop those errors, because it won't stop everything all in one go. So there clearly is a circular thing here where you keep revisiting it and keep amending it and keep tweaking it. And I'll come up with some ideas in a moment about how you would do that as well. So implement the checklist, and this is another reason why you don't want to do hundreds, is because your team don't want to be getting involved in doing hundreds of new checklists next week. You just want one or two to be introduced, get them used to the idea, prove to them that it works, prove to them that it solves the problem it was intended to, and then they'll be quite keen for it to be rolled out in other areas. So it's a gradual process across the whole of the business, but it can take many years to get everything covered by a decent system and checklist. So that's the main 5-part thing, but there's a number of things that I would call follow-on steps that would then naturally occur as a result. And although these might crop up in other areas of the business, they definitely are linked into having checklists in your business. So the first one is to make the checklist part of your regular system. So it's got to be systematic. It's got to happen every time. It's no good just doing the checklist the week after they're introduced and then forgetting about them, because you'll be back to square one and you'll have wasted a load of time bringing the checklist into place. Now, one way that can be done, which is what we do in our business, we have a program called System Builder, which basically sits on everybody's computer. It's also available on iPads and iPhones for people as well. And all the checklists we use are shown there. And it's a great training tool as well, because if we take on a new member of staff, we can simply show them our systems on System Builder, and they would immediately be able to go through that and understand what it is we do and how we do it, rather than have to sit with another member of staff getting trained. So I've put a screenshot up there, and this is, as I say, from a computer program, so you can see there that that's a list of checklists. It's only a very small part of it, you can see at the top that it says we've got 25 pages containing 247 checklists, and that's part of an overall systems manual, computerized manual, that has about 4,000 systems. So checklists are part of the overall process, not the only systematic way of doing the business. But they're very useful, very handy, but they need to be practical. They need to be available. No good having it in a systems manual shoved in a cupboard somewhere if your electricians and plumbers are out on the tools, because they'll never be able to see it. So it has to be available, it has to be part of the relevant systems, and it needs to be available to every single team member very quickly and very easily. So you need to make sure that happens, otherwise it will just be a waste of time. You need to ensure team buy-in. Well, obviously, many of the 5 steps that I talked about earlier will involve the team getting involved with it for one reason or another. So you've got to get the team involved in the process. That way you're more likely to get a buy-in to doing it. Hopefully checklists aren't a major problem to get the team to buy into, but if they're certainly involved in the creation of checklists and the systemization, then they should run with it, especially when you can then prove at the end of a certain period what that success rate is and what it means to them. So I would think you'd have no trouble persuading an electrician to follow systems if you can prove that the number of times they've had to go back to the storeroom has halved. Use other systems as well. So as I say, checklists don't exist in the systems process on their own. So things like agendas, which in itself is a sort of checklist of what to do in a meeting, all of those things, standard letters, standard emails, any standard documents, standard forms fit in with that as well, and all of those we use on our System Builder software. And just as a by the by, the System Builder software is available to every single client who joins us. So if you're listening and you are a client and you're not actually using System Builder yet, then make a note to speak to me or one of my team, because I would recommend that that's a great way to start bringing this into place, and it's free for you. Then measure and tweak. So as I say, don't just bring in a checklist and just think job done. You've got to measure what the impact are and tweak it, because there will still be some errors that come on. And a way to tweak it that we use in our business is called a system improvement form. We used to call it a stuff up form, but what that basically does is if we have something going wrong, there's a form to fill out, and one of the questions on that is, do we already have a checklist or system to try and solve this problem? If we do, what went wrong with that checklist that allowed a mistake still to be made, and therefore it would then prompt revisiting that checklist or system and maybe tweaking it so it works even better. And I'll show you at the end that you can get a copy of this. We'll happily send this to you, and that's just a screenshot of part of it, and that would be filled out by the team every time something goes wrong, whether or not a customer actually is aware of it. So it could be that a letter had the wrong address on it, but we managed to find that out before it went out the door. But there could have been other occasions when we may not have realized and it would have gone out. So we need to do a system improvement form to stop that ever happening. And I say, a customer may not have even known that could have been a potential problem. That's the time to sort it out, is before they even get to know about it. So a system improvement form would help assess and tweak existing checklists and systems that are already in place to make sure that they work and get reviewed regularly. So hopefully that quick subject has been of use. As I say, the danger is that you think, oh yeah, that's very simple, don't really need to get too involved in that, we know what checklists are. But I would make the effort to go through the 5-point checklist and bring it in as a major part of your business, and be very happy for people to let me know how they get on with that if they do introduce checklists, or indeed if it's not quite working out and want some help. We'd be happy to do that. There's some things that can be done next. We have a insider report which we call Business Bite Size on this very subject, and if you contact us, and I'll show you how in a minute, we'll gladly send you a copy of that. So that's the Business Bite Size insider report about checklists and errors, and that's a 4-page document. It also comes with a set of tools to tell you exactly what to do in more detail than this webinar will, and that's an 8-page document that we'll gladly send you as well, courtesy of you attending today's webinar. Next things to do is watch out for something we're going to launch towards the end of this year or next year, which is called Get and Give a Million, which is where we're going to give free help to businesses to try and in total come up with £1 million worth of ideas, business growth ideas or tax saving ideas for our clients and for people that aren't yet clients. And in the process of doing that, we're also going to be giving 1 million things to various charities and projects internationally, so they will be linked, and that should be a huge project for us. So keep an eye out for that. We'll be sending out loads of information later in the year. If you want a copy of the system improvement form, happy to let you have that. Again, just contact us. I'll give you some contact details in a moment. Next webinar, which is slightly more big picture stuff, a lot more intense and stuff to do than today's subject. That's in January 2018, and that's on how to basically run your business from one single page of information. In the current climate of cloud accounting and computerization, it is now eminently possible to run your business with all the key stuff you need to know from one page of paper that you look at regularly. So we're going to go through that, hugely useful, and I think something that every business should do. And the next live seminar, which we do every couple of months in Plymouth at the Future Inn, just up near Derriford, a couple of miles out of Plymouth, is on sales and marketing. That's an introduction on practical methods of improving sales and marketing, things that you may not learn from marketing agencies, things that might not be so obvious, but it's practical. And by practical, I mean it gets new clients, it gets increases in sales, rather than theoretical branding type ideas which sound very good but actually don't put any money on the table. So we're looking at that. That's in November, 16th of November. Details of that are on our website as well, or you can just contact us for information. So contact details for any of that, email Wendy at, and she will gladly go through all that. And if you've got any questions about today, didn't quite get the gist of anything or wanted a bit more follow-up information, Wendy's your point of contact for anything to do with that. The website, which has got details of future events on, is listed there. Or if you just want to ring us and have a chat or ask for something, then the phone number's on there as well. So a quicker one today, but hopefully something that you found interesting and useful. I'd be very keen to know how you get on implementing that in your business or organisation. But for the moment, thank you very much for attending and look forward to seeing you at one of the live events or at the webinars in due course.